and a very happy new year to all of you. We're seeing some very bright faces who have come after a holiday and ready for a interesting, invigorating, tough semester, I hope. We are very delighted to have with us two very eminent academicians, Dr. Lissa Lincoln and Dr. David, and they will be they had heard about our center, seen much of the work we have done, and through your contact when we spoke to them, I thought it is a very good idea for them to visit us, and I'm very delighted that they gladly agreed to fit in our thing during their India visit, and so we're very grateful for them for having taken the time to be with us today. But this is the first day of the new semester, so we hope that we will start the new semester almost as an inaugural lecture by Dr. Lissa, and very aptly, given the nature of our course, very aptly she's speaking on Deleuze and Camus, and which I'm sure many of our students have been reading Camus, and they've also been reading Deleuze thanks to George. So we'll have, I'm sure, a very interesting discussion on this topic. I also want to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Gayatri Prabhu, who is our new faculty member, who has just joined us joined us a couple of weeks back, and she'll be teaching us in this. Our students will be having her as a teacher also this semester. For those of you, since most of you have come in today, you may not know her. She's from English literature background, has done a very interesting background in critical and creative writing. She did a master's at Wales, the Swansea, if I pronounce it right, and then from there her PhD is from Nebraska, where she did a very fascinating thesis on critical and creative writing, and on this topic of the Bethal stories, which I'm sure many of us have read and enjoyed so much. So it's a great privilege to welcome her to the department, and I'm sure you'll all enjoy her teaching and her research and her ideas to a great extent. May I now invite our colleague Nikhil to formally welcome Lissa.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the new semester, and thanks especially to all of you all who made it here. To the people who haven't, there's some new regime of governmentality Sundar is going to institute. Nikhil is going to institute, flogging in public, and we're going to be old-fashioned again, But today we're not talking about Foucault. I guess we'll talk about his twin. So I take great pleasure, and it's an honor to welcome Dr. Lissa Lincoln from the Department of Comparative Literature and English, the American University of Paris. And I think the topic seems to really, as Sundar said, fit our whole interdisciplinary thrust. We have, I think we all try to do this kind of work where neither the literature side is compromised nor the philosophy side, and it actually all adds up. And they're these doubling mirrors of each other, and they're both pushed to the limit. So, and I think there's a third component, which is law, and since we have lawyers, qualified lawyers in our midst, so I think it'd be really fascinating wrestling of these very big themes, literature, philosophy, law. And I think this is a particularly fascinating from just the abstract about the idea of the philosophy of law lying within the philosophy of literature, the idea of a certain privileging of the use and function of literary techniques rather than the ideas and senses. So we'd want to really hear a lot about all these, and we really hope that we know this will be a wonderful lecture, and we hope there'll be a lot of good questions. So George, I'm looking at you for the Deleuze questions, and Nikita wrote a wonderful paper on Camus, but she's not here. We have lots of lawyers, so and all of us, I'm sure, will have something to say, so we're really looking forward to this lecture. And welcome again, everybody, and welcome to you again. Thank you.
No. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to meet the person you were speaking about, as a matter of fact. I should first of all perhaps begin with a caveat and say that I am neither a lawyer, I have no training in legal scholarship per se, nor am I a deleuzian. I am a specialist in Camus. So apologies in advance to any of you who hear me saying some kind of heresy in those areas. But at the same time, I think that perhaps my own academic and intellectual background is proof in many ways of the power of literature. In fact, the power of Camus' thought, insofar as I believe it allows us to understand a larger question which envelops both law and philosophy with regards to some of the things that I'll touch on in Deleuze. And hopefully it will bring us to some points of mutual interrogation ourselves. So one Deleuze scholar, Alexandre Lefebvre, begins his work entitled The Image of Law with a very pertinent question. That is, why Deleuze and law? Why this juxtaposition? Why this combination? And why indeed? It's an excellent question. After all, as Lefebvre reminds us, and I quote, "Few philosophers have so systematically criticized and rejected the concepts of law and judgment as Deleuze has." And since there's certainly no shortage of articles, whether or not explicitly from a Deleuzian perspective, criticizing and rejecting the concepts of law and judgment, adding to this collection is perhaps not the most pressing of tasks for Deleuze scholarship. Why deepen the pile? Why inflict even more talks about Deleuze and law? But an even more curious question is perhaps, why give a paper on Deleuze and Camus? Or in a word, why Deleuze and Camus? For it has to be said, I have to admit, and anyone here who knows Deleuze is well aware, that despite the philosopher's obvious and well-known interest in literature, the French existentialist moralist Albert Camus was decidedly not one of the writers that interested Gilles Deleuze. One of the reasons for this is no doubt the fact that Camus represented the reprehensible sort of humanism that Michel Foucault held in such contempt. The very humanism that he described, Foucault that is, as, and I quote, "the little prostitute of all thought, of all culture, of all morality, and of all politics for the last 20 years. In the case of Deleuze, this was also the reflection of the way in which philosophers in general, and Sartreans in particular, perceive Camus' work. And let's not forget that Deleuze himself was a Sartrean, and I quote Deleuze. This comes from a little text called He Was My Teacher. In those days, this is where Deleuze says a little something about Sartre. In those days, who except Sartre knew how to say anything new? Who taught us new ways to think? As brilliant and profound as the work of Merleau-Ponty was, it was professorial and depended in many respects on Sartre's work. Sartre readily likened the existence of human beings to the non-being of a hole in the world, little lakes of nothingness, he called them. But Merleau-Ponty took them to be folds, simple folds and pleats. In this way, one can distinguish a tough, penetrating existentialism from a more tender and reserved existentialism. As for Camus, alas, either it was inflated heroism or it was second-hand absurdity. Camus claimed descent from a line of cursed thinkers, but his whole philosophy just led us back to Lalande and Meyerson, writers well known to any undergraduate. So this is Deleuze's indictment of Camus. On a broader scale, Camus' work is habitually associated with a very specific, or more precisely, a very moral concept of literature. Generally speaking, this perspective of Camus' work can be divided into two categories. On the one hand, we have the positive image of Camus, the literary genius, whose creative work brilliantly reflects the rigorous moral, philosophical system laid out in his theoretical thought. The latter being expressed, for the most part, through his non-fiction writing, namely the myth of Sisyphus and the rebel. This viewpoint is usually associated with the image of Camus, the eminent, as opposed to soft, humanism. On the other, he is seen as a very unoriginal, or even a weak thinker, philosophically speaking, whose theoretical writings lack both intellectual rigor and integrity. At best, a hasty and less than accurate revision of Nietzsche, and at worst, a dangerous strain of the armchair humanism evoked by Foucault a little bit earlier. This viewpoint, while still generally according the status of brilliance to Camus' literary work, sees within it a subjacent drive to promote the philosophical ideas or theses conveyed in the author's non-literary essays. In both cases, his work is reduced, on a theoretical level, to a series of romans à thèse. Indeed, it would seem that Camus was representative of a kind of literature that might appear to be in direct opposition to Deleuze's literary tastes, or at the very least, one that he considered outdated, a literature centered on subjects in opposition and the torments of decision, a kind of obsolescent existentialist writing with its characters and dramatic circumstances. In short, a literature based on what Deleuze in Toward a Minor Literature calls the idea of the tragic, of the internal drama, of the intimate tribunal, and so on. Associated as it is with existential romans à thèse, Camus' work would seem to be the direct antithesis, then, of what interested Deleuze in literature. The paradigm of major, that is, representational literature, it incarnated as such one of these literary styles, genre, or movements that, again to quote Toward a Minor Literature, have only one single dream: to assume a major function in language, to offer themselves as a sort of state language that Deleuze opposes to minor literature, one which, and I quote again, creates the opposite dream, knowing how to create a becoming minor. Deleuze's interest in literature lay in the direction of writing that proposed an alternative to the concept of the self-conscious subject as a pivoting point for the coordination or organization of experience, one that expressed a non-anthropocentric or anti-humanist point of view, a viewpoint which corresponds not only to a logic of sense, but also to Deleuze's own conceptions of time, life, and destiny, in which the time of an individual life is not seen as linear, progressive sequence, but as a structure of repetition and variation. At the time, he did not see a literature based on positivism. At the same time, he did not see a literature based on positivism, that is, one based on a scientific explanatory model that reduce experience, knowledge, culture, and so on to underlying material cause. He did not see this kind of a literature as a viable alternative to the subjective point of view, since subjectivity and positivism were, in his eyes, just two sides of the same representational coin. As such, Deleuze's interest lies in a form of literature that functions as what the critic Renegade has called a double attack on these two levels of representation. In Deleuze's words, the subject as the self-conscious center of representation, and positivism as the view that reality can be represented as a totality of so-called facts. To sum up, it is difficult to imagine an author further removed from the philosophical ideas and literary tastes of Gilles Deleuze than the author Albert Camus. However, and at the same time, it's important to remember that Camus was also, and contrary to Sartre, one of the forerunners of the new literature. he was held in the highest esteem by some of the most innovative thinkers of his time, notably Maurice Blanchot, who is quoted extensively throughout Deleuze's work and by whom, it is well known, both Deleuze and Foucault were tremendously influenced. Admittedly, and in the eyes of the intellectual elite problematically, Camus was not a representative of the political avant-garde of the 50s, especially as this was the period of the Nobel Prize and the Algerian War. But in many respects, this position of indecision and non-critique is much closer to Blanchot and Deleuze's style than that of a Sartre. Undeniably, the literature of Camus is not that of Sartrean commitment. But this is not, as is generally thought, due to an incapacity in Camus to think through thoroughly and live without contradiction his so-called moralism. It is, rather, because Camus was a different project entirely, a project, I will argue, of a dismantling of power. What is particularly interesting, as we will see, is the fact that this dismantling is done from within a machine of power itself, the literary machine, an assemblage of enunciation or expression, to quote Deleuze. Camus' literature, I would suggest, mimics the project of assuming a major function in language and of offering itself as a sort of state language. However, it is most precisely not that. If he resembles a totalizing intellectual, let's not forget that Camus is not Sartre. He did not want to be labeled as an existentialist. He did not call for a new humanism. But the proximity between the two thinkers, between Deleuze and Camus, is in fact much greater than this. In his relation with literature, Deleuze gives tremendous importance to the framework of law. Questions of judgment and the juridical permeate the pages of his oeuvre. However, and perhaps curiously, although there is much questioning around Deleuzian law, it would seem that there is considerably less interest aroused by the fact that the majority of his philosophy of law lies within his philosophy of literature. Likewise, there has been enormous interest generated around the ideas of law and judgment in Camus, but very little paid to the use of them in his writing. To put it in more Deleuzian terms, critics show a keen interest in the themes of law and judgment in Camus, but have neglected the only thing that can make such an interest pertinent, that is, their function. The intent of this paper, then, is to probe this proximity, the thematic function of law, and not its sense, in literature for both Camus and Deleuze. In a passage that uncannily echoes conventional interpretations of Camus' masterpiece, The Fall, Deleuze asks, in Toward a Minor Literature, Deleuze asks, can we conclude that not being a critic of his time, Kafka turned his criticism against himself and had no other tribunal than an internal tribunal? This interpretation of Kafka that uncannily seems to reflect the traditional interpretation of Camus' The Fall, Deleuze pinpoints the insufficiency of this approach, one which binds us to the one which blinds us to the real goal of the author's non-critique. And here, of course, he's talking about Kafka's non-critique, and I quote. Here he's talking about this particular interpretation of Kafka turning his criticism against himself. I quote Deleuze, "This would be grotesque as an interpretation, since it would turn criticism into a dimension of representation. If representation is not external, it can only be internal from here on. But it's really something else in Kafka. Kafka attempts to extract from social representations assemblages of enunciations and machinic assemblages, and to dismantle these assemblages. Kafka was drawing lines of escape, but he didn't flee the world. Rather, it was the world and its representations that he made take flight, and that he made follow these lines. In the novels, the dismantling of the assemblages makes the social representation take flight in a much more effective way than a critique would have done, and brings about a deep. For Camus, like for Kafka, it is really something else than representational literature, and that it is this something else that perplexed critics, causing them to underestimate Camus' thought. Interestingly, Camus was criticized in intellectual circles for very similar reasons to those underlying the communists' opposition to Kafka. That is, the absence of any sufficiently consistent or constant voice of social criticism. Indeed, it was this very absence that provoked Camus' highly publicized rupture with Sartre, despite the fact that Camus' work is still widely associated with committed existentialist literature. However, the goal of Camus' non-critique was not to flee the world, any more than it was for Kafka. In fact, and despite the apparently opposed visions of Deleuze and Camus, what emerges when we consider their work outside of the philosophical categories and presuppositions that are normally superimposed on the latter, that is, looked at from a literary perspective, is that Camus is not so far removed from Deleuze. For both, literature is a question of dismantling and not a question of representing, whether positively or negatively, mechanisms of power and their transcendental justifications. Camus was highly suspicious of the discourses of justification that are traditionally used to explain and justify existence. Indeed, he saw this determination to justify oneself in all of one's actions as being that which distinguishes modern man from his predecessors. As he famously states in The Rebel, his philosophical essay, and this is a somewhat lengthy quote, but it is so representative of what he's trying to say here. I'll ask you to bear with me. And so I quote Camus, "Our criminals are no longer helpless children who could plead love as their excuse. On the contrary, they are adults, and they have a perfect alibi, philosophy, which can be used for any purpose, even for transforming murderers into judges. Heathcliff, in Wuthering Heights, would kill everybody on earth to possess Cathy, but it would never occur to him to say that murder is reasonable or theoretically defensible. He would commit it, and there his convictions end. This implies the power of love, and also strength of character. Since intense love is rare, murder remains an exception and preserves its aspect of infraction. But as soon as a man, through lack of character, takes refuge in doctrine, as soon as crime reasons about itself, it multiplies like reason itself and assumes all the aspects of the syllogism. Once crime was as solitary as a cry of protest. Now it is as universal as science. Yesterday it was put on trial. Today it determines the law." And that's the end of the quote. Hence, whether it be in his literary works or in his philosophical essays, Camus' project was, and to quote very briefly once again from The Rebel, to face the reality of the present, which is logical crime, and to examine meticulously the arguments by which it is justified. A rapid glance at Camus' oeuvre shows that one theme predominates. It is neither the absurd nor revolt, the two themes that traditionally we say are the center of his thought, but rather the question of justice, or rather how what is just is determined in a given situation. One has simply to evoke a few of his major works to highlight his preoccupation with this problematic. The Outsider, in which the intrigue centers around a murder and the almost burlesque trial of the taciturn misfit who committed it, incapable of defending himself against a justice system founded upon the primacy of self-justification, or The Plague, where an entire population finds itself under the yoke of an invading enemy whose assault is as unjust as it is merciless, bringing to the forefront the question of the death of the innocent. Or again, Caligula, which describes a universe of terror in which absolute power reigns, founded on a monstrously logical conception of justice. One work in particular indicates with exceptional clarity the very specific interest Camus has in this question. Camus' masterpiece, The Fall, we mentioned earlier. Almost all of the aspects usually associated within the theme of law seem to converge here. Its central concern is the problem of judgment, as revealed at the crossroads of confession and guilt. The exquisitely rhetorical monologue of its sole character, an ex-lawyer come judge penitent, is the exemplification of both an inquisition and artful self-defense. What renders Camus' suspicion of these discourses of justification particularly interesting is that he was well aware of the fact that literature itself is, of course, a justificatory discourse, and as such not incapable of justifying as well as committing its own logical crime. What was Camus' reaction faced with such a paradox? How to examine the justifications of logical crime when one's tool of analysis, language, and thus rhetoric, is haunted by, and indeed dependent on, logic itself. French political philosopher Emmanuel Renaud, in his book entitled L'expérience de l'injustice, The Experience of Injustice, talks about the particular power with which poetry can destabilize discourses of justification, due to its capacity to observe the world through a language of description, rather than judging it through a language of prescription. And I quote, "The destabilization of the modes of justification of the social order is precisely what the poet attempts to do, not to denounce, nor to demystify, but to subvert from the bottom up through a cancellation of the established logical forms." What Renaud is suggesting is that poetry is possibly a more effective model for social change than the more theoretical discourses typically associated with it, because rather than engaging with its object through a discourse of prescription, and hence via a language of judgment, as theoretical discourses do and must, the poet engages with his object through observation via a language of description. The poet then, by his very relation to language, deliberately distances himself from the ever-present danger of any theoretical approach, that of falling into judgment, and consequently of collaboration with and or perpetuation of the very social orders they are looking to challenge. It is precisely here that the work of Camus finds its power and its capacity to destabilize, that is, in his refusal of judgment. This may seem paradoxical, given the proliferation of the theme of justice in Camus, for how can justice be separated from judgment? It is here that Deleuze's warning about themes finds its place. For it is true that Camus had a great need for the themes of justice, but only in the sense of the superficial movement of his work, to put it in Deleuzian terms. And Deleuze, in Toward a Minor Literature, reminds us that here, superficial movement doesn't mean a mask underneath which something else would be hidden. The superficial movement indicates points of undoing, of dismantling, that must guide the experimentation to show the molecular movements and the machinic assemblages of which the superficial movement is a global result. That's the end of the quotation. What then is Camus' particular interest in justice? Or rather, what is this theme's function in his work? More than the simple defense of one notion, that is, justice, with regards to another opposite notion, which would then be injustice, or an attempt to justify his ideas about what is just and, in consequence, what is not, Camus' interest appears to stem from a much more nuanced objective. He is, in fact, interested not so much in transmitting, whether through promotion or denunciation, an idea or ideal of justice, but rather in questioning how it is we come to decide what is just in a given situation. Not, to use a paradigmatic example, whether Meursault, the central character of The Outsider, for example, is guilty or innocent of killing an Arab on the beach, but rather how his innocence or guilt is decided. Looked at from this angle, Camus' interest would seem to be less related to a paradoxical desire to judge different aspects of justice than to understand the mechanisms upon which any system of judgment depends. Camus would not, then, seem to be looking to convince the reader that a given system of justice is right or wrong, good or bad, moral or immoral. Nor does his interest lie in unmasking a hidden underside to universal justice per se. He is looking, rather, to examine and to describe the function of the different strategies of power which are inherent to all systems of judgment and consequently to all prescriptive, or in its largest sense, legal discourses. That is, discourses that prescribe or legislate laws, rules, and codes of conduct in domains that exceed and indeed subsume the purely juridical. Thus, the theme of law, both in its strict and in its broader sense, permits Camus to indicate the points of unraveling, of undoing in these discourses, allowing him to trace the minute movements of judgment of which justice is simply a result. In this sense, for Camus, justice as a universal value doesn't exist. It is, rather, what Deleuze calls an abstract machine. Camus' dismantling of this machine takes its form in the numerous figures through which he undertakes an interrogation of discourses of judgment, the most vertiginous of which being that of Clamence, our judge penitent of the fall. In this novel, we have a particularly enlightening example of the machinations of judgment, because Clamence incites the reader to participate himself in the question of judgment and succeeds in ensnaring him in its nets. Thus, not only does the text illustrate the problem of judgment for the reader, it subjects him to it directly. Despite a growing resistance to Clamence's discourse, who proves himself increasingly less reliable as a narrator as the story progresses, the reader persists in following him, spurred on by his hope of being led to the real or true perspective that would allow him to interpret objectively everything he's being told. However, what he discovers at the end of the story is that this longed-for perspective simply does not exist. There is no true or false existing outside of Clamence's discourse that would allow the reader to judge it objectively, for it is Clamence's discourse itself which creates these impressions within the reader, according to the interpretation that the narrator wishes to produce. And in the case of Clamence, it is a discourse with a very clear goal: to make the reader guilty in order to make himself innocent. In the end, Clamence's solution for escaping judgment consists, finally, of establishing himself as a supreme judge by means of first fabricating a sense of guilt in, then extracting a confession from his interlocutor. We begin to see then how this work indicates the particularity of Camus' interest in the mechanics that support the system of judgment. He has no interest in convincing the reader that Clamence is in the right or in the wrong, that he's good or bad, moral or immoral, guilty or innocent. Rather, he is interested in tracing, examining, and describing the functioning of different strategies of power. Where Clamence possesses total power in his interlocutor's conception of reality, the author, indeed any author, has this same role with regards to his readers. Likewise, on a larger scale, whoever holds the dominant discourse, the narrator in the register of the story, the author in the register of literature, the judge in the register of law, etc., will always be the one who creates truth through the imposition of his interpretation of reality in order to assure the reinforcement and perpetuation of his own value system. Hence, the possibility of justifying a prescriptive, whether judicial or literary, discourse is shaken in its foundations. Once truth is revealed to be nothing but a construction which serves to perpetuate a value system, there is no longer any point in justifying it, nor, for that matter, in condemning it. What becomes important is to observe how the system works. Or to quote Deleuze, how it works is the sole question. In this sense, rather than appearing to be a text of cynical moralism, the Fall becomes a sort of instruction manual. We encounter this same configuration in what is possibly one of Camus' most disturbing pieces, the short story The Renegade. It also provides us with one of the most vivid examples of how the author uses law, this time in its broader moral sense through the theme of religion, to indicate points of unraveling and dismantling of discourses of judgment. Indeed, the discourse of judgment appears here to be subverted from the bottom up, from the onset, reduced to delirious diatribe of revenge. The sole character, the renegade himself, a heretic Catholic missionary, imprisoned and tortured by the population he set out to convert, recounts his trajectory to himself in a state of utter delirium, a delirium into which the reader is plunged from the opening words of the monologue. In his efforts to reinterpret the events that led to his current demise, he presents the reader with explicitly prescriptive discourses rooted in diametrically opposed value systems, good and evil. Despite his obsession for order, the inner contradictions manifest in his adherence to first one and then the other of these value systems creates a certain resistance in the reader, impelling him to look for alternative interpretations of the events than those provided by a narrator who seems less than reliable. As a result, the reader becomes aware that far from adhering to a given truth supporting the authority of these discourses, the renegade's interest in them is linked uniquely to power. The truth of a discourse is determinable only insofar as it proves itself stronger than the others, that is, when it wins. As such, the madness of the renegade might be seen as not only that of a tortured individual, but also that of justificatory discourse in all of its implacable logic. One could multiply here the examples. In the plague, for example, one is confronted with the debilitating effect that occurs when judgment encounters that which is irreducible to the values or truths that supposedly underlie its authority. No longer able to maintain his abstract, detached perspective of the plague, once faced with the concrete reality of the anguished death of an innocent child, the character of the priest, up to this point an embodiment of absolute certainty in a transcendental justice, begins to doubt the possibility of justifying his value system to the point of his own psychological paralysis and eventual annihilation. In Caligula, we encounter the at once bizarre and terrorizing relationship that exists between the arbitrary and the absolute in judicial institutions. The central character of the play, Caligula, a young emperor invested with complete power, is an image of authority untethered from any need for justification. In The Just Assassins, we see the tendency in any prescriptive discourse, be it political, judicial, or ideological, and regardless of the altruism of the ideas behind it, to slide into tyranny as soon as it begins to establish itself as a solution to moral problems. One could cite further examples encompassing even the author's more obscure works, such as Lot, Jonas, Le Malentendu, etc., to indicate the extent to which the problem of judgment and its underlying dogmatism permeates Camus' oeuvre. It is here that Deleuze's concept of dogmatic thought recognition, categorization, versus creative thought is very helpful. I'm just going to digress for a very brief moment to remind ourselves of what dogmatic thought actually means for Deleuze. And we see that he says that the dogmatic image of thought is something that signifies for Deleuze a set of implicit presuppositions operative throughout the history of philosophy about what it means to think, and on that compromise the true exercise of thought, creativity. In short, philosophy and common sense alike, or rather philosophy as compromised by its unexamined common sense, have assumed certain things about thought, what it is and what it does. Deleuze calls this image of thought dogmatic, first because it has been drawn from the very realm of opinion and common sense from which philosophy has classically pretended to break and get its start, and second because it assumes that recognition is the vocation of thought. Thought, therefore, equals recognition. With recognition as its aim, thought is reduced to a task of identification, and, as a consequence of its drive to recognize, dogmatic thought threatens to assimilate all its potential encounters with things, with others, with texts, etc., into the concepts and categories used to assimilate them. On the deterritorialization of the world that is itself political and that has nothing to do with an activity of intimacy. And that's the end of the quote by Deleuze. Thus, far from providing a means for its author to flee the world, Deleuze sees in Kafka's literature, by virtue of its very refusal of representational criticism, a much more radical approach to both creation and critique. I will argue that, on the other hand, we see that the unrecognized or the encounter is a metaphysical violence, quite the opposite from this notion of recognition. An encounter occurs whenever cliches, habits, categories, and propositional certitudes are no longer sufficient to account for, think, and react within a given situation. This is a claim that Deleuze never abandons. It is with force and necessity that encounters cause us to break from dogmatic thought and the recognizable form that dogmatism assigns to the outside. And so, having summarized briefly what Deleuze means by dogmatic thought and what he sees as its essential danger, that is that it prevents the possibility of encounter of true creative thought, and looking at some of the things we've seen in this very brief overview of some of Camus' essential texts, we have to ask ourselves, what, if not dogmatic thought, is Camus identifying and dismantling in his discussion of mechanisms of power? How not to see, in the examples that we have looked at, evidence of Camus' resistance to a kind of thought that has as its implicit or explicit goal the prevention of a genuine engagement with an outside thought, with encounters irreducible to itself. Whether it be on the register of literature, in the reader's encounter with the magisterial manipulations of a narrator who adroitly sidesteps and exploits to his own ends our dogmatic attempts to recognize or categorize the truth of his discourse, or on the level of the story, the discursive dementia of an agonizing renegade spewing vitriolic attacks against a reality that denies the possibility of absolute truth or absolute interpretation, or the slow inner implosion that eventually shatters the world of a priest unable to accept the cracks and ensuing ambiguity in the edifice of absolute certainty upon which his faith depends, Camus' oeuvre would seem to bring to the forefront constructions of resistance. On the one hand, it throws into relief dogmatic thought's resistance to, or more precisely, suppression of, encounters irreducible to itself, and on the other, highlights a kind of counter-resistance, that of outside thought to its assimilation, recognition, categorization, by dogmatism. Hence the renegade's rage and ultimate defeat, faced with reality's refusal to cooperate with his demands for absolutes. The priest's bafflement in consequent disintegration when his value system encounters something irreducible to itself. Or, on another level, the reader's confusion faced with Clamence's refusal to provide a trustworthy, that is, identifiable, narrative. Hence also, it might be suggested, the perplexity of conventional critics faced with the resistance of Camus' oeuvre to their attempts to classify it according to pre-existing categories, moralist, humanist, existentialist, or even to Camus' own pre-existing work. In this sense, we might say that for Camus, as for Deleuze, what makes thought dogmatic is the fact that it in effect suppresses encounters through recognition and categorization, and as such chokes off all possibility of real creation. This brings us back to what Deleuze identifies as the supreme instance of dogmatic thought, transcendental judgment. It is in its assumption that everything encountered can be recognized that thought demonstrates its dogmatic quality. The problem, of course, with this kind of dogmatism is that it in effect prevents the occurrence of real, that is, creative thought. Precisely because thought, in order to be creative, that is, to think as opposed to recognize, must be impacted by an external encounter, one that it can neither engender nor anticipate. In a passage, once again fairly long, but it's the last long passage I'll read, from Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says this: concepts only ever designate possibilities. They lack the clause of absolute necessity. In other words, of an original violence done to thought. The clause of a strangeness or an enmity which alone would awaken thought from its natural stupor or eternal possibility. There is only involuntary thought, aroused but constrained within thought, and all the more absolutely necessary for being born illegitimately of fortuitousness in the world. Thought is primarily trespass and violence, the enemy, and nothing presupposes philosophy. Everything begins with misosophy. Do not count on thought to ensure the relative necessity of what it thinks. Rather, count upon the contingency of an encounter with that which forces thought to raise up and educate the absolute necessity of an active thought or a passion to think. The conditions of a true critique and a true creation are the same. The destruction of an image of thought which presupposes itself and the genesis of the active thinking in thought itself. Something in the world forces us to think. This something is an object not of recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. That's the end of the quotation. So, as concluding remarks, we are now in a better position to answer our initial question. Why Deleuze and Camus? First, on the most obvious level, Deleuze's thought allows us to free Camus from the clutches of dogmatic thought. Camus' literary work has been so deeply entangled with the fact that the outsider is one of any high school student's rites of passage, and his non-fiction work used as a preparation or an appetizer for serious philosophy classes, that it is today almost impossible to actually encounter it in the Deleuzian sense of the word, as opposed to simply recognize it. Deleuze allows us to see a much more interesting facet of Camus, that of a writer actively dismantling the very mechanisms he is typically considered to be representing. Thus we see that in the case of literary criticism, or in Deleuzian terms, critique, as in the case of literature itself, or creation, this method of active dismantling that doesn't make use of criticism that is still part of representation is much more intense than any critique. Literature, like philosophy, being dependent on established logical forms, even when it sets out to expose them, is inherently plagued by the danger of transcendental judgment and, consequently, of being rendered sterile through the blockage of real creative thought, as opposed to mere identification or recognition, as in the case of literature rooted in representation. It is precisely this problematic rapport with his own role as a writer that preoccupied Camus. The power of language is not that of preventing us from attaining the real. It is that of forcing us to assume, despite ourselves, its normative power. Escape via pure creation is for Camus an illusion, and produces what he refers to as salon nihilists. The reason is simple. All discourse, whether it wants to or not, exercises a form of power. However strong the revolt that incites it, it will invariably degenerate into terror and tyranny if it doesn't turn against its own power. Any creation of values is a seizing of power, and any power that instates itself slides into tyranny. Deleuze reminds us of this in terms of the literary machine. And I quote, "Let no one say that this line of escape is present only in spirit, as though writing isn't also a machine, as though it isn't also an act, even when it is independent of publication, as though the machine of writing isn't also a machine, sometimes taken up by capitalist, fascist, or bureaucratic machines, sometimes tracing a modest revolutionary line. Let us note Kafka's constant idea. Even with a solitary mechanic, the literary machine of expression is capable of anticipating or precipitating contents into conditions that, for better or worse, concern an entire collectivity. Hence the particular power of poetry, as opposed to creation based on representation, to destabilize established logical forms of power. It is the poet who provides a response to the logical crime, precisely not through a language of judgment, that is, identification, recognition, that will either denounce or demystify, and in so doing run the risk of degenerating into the very established logic it sets out to denounce, or flight, fleeing the world, but rather by a movement of subversion, an act of playful sabotage of the very rules that bind and define it, once again to subvert from the bottom up through a cancellation of the established logical forms. This is also interesting for understanding why Deleuze passes through literature in his critique of law. The voice of the poet is indeed the royal road to dismantling transcendental judgment through the destabilization of its discourses of justification, notably law. Because of their common trait, rhetoric, whose judiciary and literary roots can be traced back to ancient Greece, literature and law are both pervaded with the need to propose alternatives to pure rhetoric within their respective discourses. That is, to establish that their discourses cannot be reduced to just rhetoric, but rather are rooted in something else. In both cases, it's a matter of calling into question discursive norms. A juxtaposition of the two discourses thus provides fertile ground for examining their respective and reflective internal tension, that between good discourse and rhetoric. It is this relation of tension between the two domains that emerges in the questioning of the act of writing through legal discourse. But there's also another and symmetrical interest in studying both Camus and Deleuze, or to provoke an encounter, so to speak, that did not occur. In fact, as alluded to in the first part of this paper, Camus appears by all accounts to be a paradigm of major literature. Of course, one could certainly try to argue that he was not that he was part of a minority, that is, the Pieds Noirs from Algeria, and more than this, his first study on poverty of the Kabyle population in northern Algeria, that had a deep influence on his work, would seem to point to a typical process of becoming minor. His first published work, The Outsider, is commonly taken as a dismantling not only of the representation of justice, but also of the state language. He created the blank writing, l'écriture blanche, that so impressed Barthes and Blanchot, and which was so influential on the French Nouveau Roman. Finally, it cannot be stressed enough, Camus was not Sartre. He loved football, the beach of Tipaza, more than the smoky cafes of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. He did not want to launch a school of thought, nor even to belong to one. He had no romantic entreaty to revolutionary ideals, concealing sheer desire for the appropriation of power. But still, we cannot escape the evidence. Camus is not the first example that comes to mind when speaking of minor literature, and there are good reasons for this. In identifying the various factors that could have led him toward a becoming minor, one cannot help but see that he seems, in reality, to have cautiously and deliberately avoided moving in such a direction. This fact, I would like to suggest, could lead to a very interesting interrogation around Deleuze's philosophy of law, insofar as it belongs to a philosophy of literature. If I am indeed correct, and Camus' work does offer a parallel to Deleuze's analyses of the dismantling of transcendental justifications, this would mean that many features that were correlated with minor literature belong in fact to something deeper, namely an intimate connection between literature and the figures of law, which is independent of the former's becoming minor or not. Now, one might argue that this is an innocuous remark, and that distinguishing between what belongs to the becoming minor and what to the dismantling of transcendental justifications is inconsequential. But this is not entirely true. As greatly emphasized by Jacques Rancière, Deleuze's aesthetic carries its own danger. Although it is directed against the representational model of literature and the figure of the almighty subject, it relies heavily on representations and classical figures of subjectivity to conduct its demonstration. What interests Deleuze in the case of Kafka is how literature reflects something of world history and how it is traversed by political and social microdeterminations. But when one looks closely at this relationship, this way of reflecting is a kind of second-level representation. Moreover, it relies heavily on a very classical figure of the subject, in this case, Kafka, the writer, in the grips of political and cultural oppression. In this sense, and on a very different plane, Deleuze himself might be seen as guilty of the very representation he set out to undermine, and this representation would be a very important factor in the allegorical process which grounds the characterization of a minor literature. This is perhaps, in fact this is most likely, a misunderstanding in the reading of Deleuze, but it is a misunderstanding that is persistent and which threatens Deleuzianism in its risk of becoming itself dogmatic thought, as opposed to a toolbox. If its encounter with Camus could help liberate us from this misunderstanding, this encounter would be, in and of itself, far from minor. Indeed, perhaps Camus would seem to have almost uncannily anticipated Deleuze's final exhortation in his chapter on minor literature. Let us profit from this moment in which anti-philosophy is trying to become a language of power. Thank you.